Witnesses. That first hearing yesterday started at 10 a.m. Eastern. The second impeachment hearing is tomorrow, but it does not start at 10 a.m. Eastern like the first one did. It starts an hour earlier at 9 a.m., not 10. So you probably need to reset your alarm or replan your morning around when you're telling people you will not be available to answer the phone. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Tomorrow's witness is going to be Masha Yovanovitch. She was a casualty of President Trump's scheme in Ukraine in that she was pulled out of her job as U.S. ambassador in that country after a bizarre smear campaign against her that was led by people like the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and the president's eldest son. Why was he involved in the campaign against Masha Yovanovitch as Ukraine ambassador? Why was he involved? It also involved the president's indicted lethal friends, who he insists he has definitely never met, definitely never had anything to do with. He definitely doesn't know these guys, has never encountered them, wouldn't know them from Adam. But these guys are now charged under a federal indictment that, among other things, lays out their role in this weird smear campaign to oust the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Maria Yovanovitch. So we'll have more on that coming up later on this show, later on in the show this hour. And, of course, we'll all get to hear from Maria Yovanovitch tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern. I have thought all week that tomorrow's hearing was at 10. It's not. It's at 9. If the reaction to the first day of the hearings is anything to go by, I think we should expect that tomorrow's going to be another big deal. You know, it's a historic day when the headline about any one news event spreads across all of the columns, right? The entire masthead of the national papers. This is the headline from the Washington Post today for the first day, reporting on the first day of the Trump impeachment. Testimony puts Trump closer to scandal. This was the all the way across the front page headline in the New York Times today. They put theirs in all capital letters. Envoys reveal scope of Trump-Ukraine push. This was the LA Times. Testimony builds case against Trump. Here's the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Pressure campaign. Testimony ties Trump more directly to Ukraine efforts. This was the Philly Inquirer. Historic hearings begin. This was the print edition of Politico. Democrats land damning new evidence in testimony. This was one of my favorites, actually, the Providence Journal in Rhode Island. They kept it simple because this is the whole, top half of the whole front page, all driven by that big photo and then the supporting photos of the sort of supporting cast of characters. But that simple headline, impeachment begins. If you still subscribe to the print edition of the paper, number one, God bless you. That's how I learned how to read as a little kid, was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. Thank you, Mom and Dad, for always having at least one newspaper around. If you do get the print edition of your paper wherever you live today, with whatever your local paper's headline was on the front page about the start of the impeachment, this is probably one of those issues of the newspaper you want to tuck away and save, right? This is history. This just doesn't happen very often in the United States of America. But we are now in the middle of it. Going forward, the second impeachment hearing is going to be tomorrow, and there is breaking news tonight on the scope of the inquiry. Super interesting to me. The Washington Post was first to report tonight that an official named Mark Sandy is expected to testify to the impeachment committees. Now, this is a name we have not previously heard in conjunction with the impeachment. Who is Mark Sandy? Why is this important? Excellent question. Super interesting answer. I think this is fascinating. All right, you go back to the original whistleblower's complaint. And you'll remember, right up at the top of the whistleblower's complaint, we got the core allegation that has led to the impeachment and that will likely ultimately lead to the first article of impeachment against the president. The whistleblower's complaint said right at the top, in the course of my official duties, I have received information from multiple U.S. government officials that the president of the United States is using the power of his office to solicit interference from a foreign country in the 2020 U.S. election. This interference includes, among other things, pressuring a foreign country to investigate one of the president's main domestic political rivals. So that was like the opening gambit. That was the thesis statement of the whistleblower's complaint, right? And that's the main thing the president's being impeached for. You can't ask a foreign government. You can't ask a foreign entity, even a foreign person, for help in a U.S. election. The president doing so with a foreign government, trying to get that foreign government to announce an investigation into his potential opponent in his re-election effort. I mean, you can't do that. That's not legal. And so we get this whistleblower from the intelligence community who blows the whistle on the fact that the president was doing this. And then, in fact, the whistleblower cites, multiple U.S. officials as the source for his whistleblower claim. I've received information from multiple U.S. government officials, and in fact, multiple U.S. officials confirmed that it happened. And then the president confessed that he did it. And so now we're having a big impeachment. Everybody's invited. But you might also remember that the whistleblower had this complaint that laid out that basic allegation that we saw and supporting information around it, described what happened in the phone call to the Ukrainian president and all that other stuff. But then the whistleblower also attached to his or her complaint a classified addendum. This was a page and a half. It was described by the whistleblower as classified. It was ultimately declassified, so it could be released to the public. That's why we can see most of it, although there are still some redactions. And it was in that part of the whistleblower's complaint, in the classified addendum, that the whistleblower mentioned that in addition to his or her other claims about the president's behavior, Holy Toledo, looks like in addition to the president soliciting Ukraine to give him help against Joe Biden, it also looks like the president was holding up aid to Ukraine while he applied that pressure on them. This is from the classified annex of the whistleblower's complaint. Quote, on 18 July, an Office of Management and Budget official informed departments and agencies that the president, earlier that month, had issued instructions to suspend all U.S. security assistance to Ukraine. Neither OMB nor National Security Council staff knew why this instruction had been issued. Again, that's from the whistleblower's complaint. And that part of it, too, has been borne out since by multiple witnesses in a position to know.
In a regular NSC secure video conference call on July 18th, I heard a staff person from the Office of Management and Budget say that there was a hold on security assistance to Ukraine, but could not say why. Toward the end of an otherwise normal meeting, a voice on the call, the person was off screen, said that she was from OMB, and her boss had instructed her not to approve any additional spending on security assistance for Ukraine until further notice. I and others sat in astonishment. The Ukrainians were fighting Russians and counted on not only the training and weapons, but also the assurance of U.S. support. All that the OMB staff person said was that the directive had come from the president.
So the president is being impeached for trying to get Ukraine to investigate Democrats to help him in his election, full stop, no matter what else he did. But the icing on that cake, right, is him using the withholding of military aid to up the pressure on Ukraine to do that. And that is also all now coming out, too, over the course of this impeachment inquiry. It was in the initial whistleblower's complaint. It has been borne out by the inquiry since. And it was the Wall Street Journal that first reported in a really important piece from October 10th. It was the Wall Street Journal that first reported how this whole issue of withholding the military aid might have played out inside the White House. And it laid out the circumstances there in a way that sort of offered a roadmap for the investigators to follow. The Wall Street Journal reported that after career budget staff members questioned the legality of delaying military aid to Ukraine, the White House instead gave a politically appointed official the authority to hold those funds, citing people familiar with the matter. The Journal said, quote, career officials at the Office of Management and Budget became worried they didn't have the legal authority to hold up the funds. And while those career civil servants did put the initial hold on the aid per the president's orders, the White House ultimately gave a political appointee named Michael Duffy the authority to continue to keep the aid on hold after the career staff began raising their concerns. A political official like Mr. Duffy signing off on apportionments is unusual, according to several former OMB officials. Career staff at OMB with years and sometimes decades of technical knowledge of the funding process have historically overseen this process. So it's weird for a political appointee to be shoved in there to do the job instead. Well, what was his qualification? What was Michael Duffy's qualification for taking over this important process that usually people with decades of technocratic experience are only allowed to run inside the White House? Right? Trained, expert career staff raised concerns that what the president has ordered here is illegal. So they take out those trained career expert staff, and they instead put in this guy, Michael Duffy, this political appointee. What about him made him qualified to do this job instead of the expert career officials? What was his background? Mr. Duffy had been, quote, the executive director of the Wisconsin Republican Party. Oh. So the president is pressuring Ukraine to give him a Joe Biden investigation. He orders military aid to Ukraine withheld while he's putting that pressure on them. The career staff at the White House say, oh, well, okay, Mr. President, we'll put a hold on this for now, but we think it's illegal to do this in any sustained sort of way. I mean, the implication of this reporting in the Wall Street Journal, although they do not explicitly assert it, the implication, or at least the thing you wonder, is whether the career staff said they weren't going to keep signing off on this drug deal, on this proverbial drug deal. And so the White House had to take those people out of the mix, say, fine, you guys don't have to sign anything. We'll instead have the former executive director of the Wisconsin Republican Party. He's working around here somewhere. We'll name him as the guy who's now in charge of signing off on the release or the holding up of military aid. And of course, naturally, he'll be fine with it. That's apparently how it worked. And so at least through July and August and well into September, when this whole scheme ultimately got exposed and the whistleblower complaint got delivered to Congress and Congress went nuts, right? Through all of that time, Ukraine was not getting its military aid on orders from the president. And in order to carry that out, the White House had to install a guy to keep signing off on holding up that aid, even though the career staffers thought that was a crime. Well, again, the Wall Street Journal reported that October 10th. Naturally, the impeachment committees thereafter subpoenaed the Wisconsin Republican Party guy to get him to come in and testify. Now, you've been signing off on what now? And how exactly did you get put in charge of that? And how are you qualified to do that? They subpoenaed him to come testify. He refused. He's ignoring the subpoena. In fact, no one from the White House Office of Management and Budget is responding to subpoenas or agreeing to testify under any terms until tonight. Until now. Now, Mark Sandy, this guy who you've never heard of in conjunction with the impeachment or anything else, Mark Sandy is saying he's going to testify. And he, given his job, would appear to be super important to the story because he appears to be the nonpartisan, technocratic, expert career official who did initially sign off on holding up this aid to Ukraine on the president's orders, but upon realizing, and we believe expressing, that what the president was ordering was illegal, he appears to be the guy who they had to push out, who they had to replace with the former executive director of the Wisconsin Republican Party, the guy who would be happy to sign off on keeping Ukraine from getting its military assistance, even if the career expert staff thought that was illegal to do so. Well, now the career expert staff guy has agreed to testify. His lawyer telling the Washington Post tonight, quote, if he is subpoenaed, he will appear. Quote, Mr. Sandy was among the career staffers who raised questions about the holdup on the aid, and his role gave him responsibility for signing the documents required to hold it up. Sandy's signature appears on at least one of these so-called apportionment letters in July that prevented the money from going to Ukraine. But after that, the process for approving or denying such funds was taken over by a political appointee at OMB, Mike Duffy, who defied a congressional subpoena to testify earlier this month. So, fascinating turn, right? Really interesting new development. I mean, it's one thing to commit a crime as president. It's another thing to not just carry it out yourself, but to order other people who work in the government to commit that crime for you. When government workers who know better realize that you're telling them to commit a crime on your behalf, and they balk at doing that, and they say no, well, sure, maybe you can find a political appointee with just the right type of moral compass to step in and take over that job from those career officials. Sure, that might work for a while. That might work until the story comes out about what you did, and then the government workers who you ordered to commit that crime, who said no to you, who you then replaced on the job with somebody who would commit that crime for you, yeah, it'll all work until those people agree to testify about what they know and about what you did. And that's where we are. So Marie Yovanovitch, who had to be pushed out as ambassador to Ukraine so that Trump and Giuliani could pull off whatever they were trying to pull off with the Ukrainian government, she's going to testify tomorrow. And this career OMB official who will be testifying about Trump holding up the military aid. That's new. That's something we just learned tonight. Now, that testimony will be a closed-door deposition on Saturday. They're going to hold that one over the weekend. Maybe ultimately that official will also be called on to give public testimony as well. We don't yet know. We'll see. But as this story evolves in this way, and ahead of tomorrow's second impeachment hearing, I think it's also just worth articulating the existence of the elephant in the room here, right? Because I know this is basic and I know you know it, but I feel like it's easy to lose sight of as we head into the second public impeachment hearing here. I mean, there's a reason that when the whistleblower complaint was first filed, that bit about holding up the military aid to Ukraine, that was filed separately in a classified appendix. I mean, the whistleblower knew that even if that complaint was getting delivered to Congress, which is what he or she wanted, still, this bit about the military aid to Ukraine being held up, the whistleblower took steps to try to make sure that that was treated with special care, that the president's order to hold up military aid to Ukraine would be handled as sensitive, classified information, that would be held tighter, it'd be restricted more, the fewer people would see that. Whistleblower want to make sure that that part of what the whistleblower was alleging, this incredibly inflammatory allegation that the whistleblower is making about the president of the United States committing clearly impeachable and illegal acts in office to benefit himself politically at the expense of U.S. national security and our allies. I mean, the whistleblower is willing to say a lot on page 1 of that complaint, but that bit about the president holding up military aid to Ukraine, keep that classified. Why should that be kept more quiet? Well, we have since learned in this education we've all had as civilians watching these impeachment proceedings roll out, as we've learned from these witnesses who are experts in this field, we have since learned from them that the reason you'd want to keep something like that as quiet as possible is because, among other things, that becoming public knowledge, it becoming known around the world that U.S. military aid to Ukraine was being held up, that itself is a damaging thing to Ukraine. Not just them losing the aid, which hurts them materially, but everybody knowing that their aid was in jeopardy, that it was being held up by the American president, that itself incurs damage.
Ukrainians would like to be able to negotiate from a position of strength, or at least more strength than they now have. Part of that strength, part of the ability of the Ukrainians to negotiate against the Russians, with the Russians for an end to the war in Donbass, depends on the United States and other international support. If we withdraw or suspend or threaten to withdraw our security assistance, that's a message to the Ukrainians, but it's at least as important, as your question indicates, Mr. Chairman, to the Russians, who are looking for any sign of weakness or any sign that we are withdrawing our support for Ukraine.
The Russians are looking for any sign of weakness, any sign that we are withdrawing our support for Ukraine. So if it becomes known that that support is threatened, that itself hurts Ukraine. That benefits Russia, right? The president was holding up aid to Ukraine to try to pressure them to cook up these investigations to help him against the Democrats in 2020. But in using Ukraine that way, and in putting on ice hundreds of millions of dollars of U.S. aid to them, he hurt them. He hurt their national security. He specifically, as Bill Taylor just explained there yesterday, he hurt their negotiating position vis-a-vis Russia, with whom they are in a war right now. Which means Russia benefits from Trump doing that. From Trump withholding that military aid, Russia benefits from that because it shows that Ukraine doesn't have the kind of American and international support that Ukraine might have thought they had. And so they're weaker than everybody thought they were. They're more at Russia's mercy. Right? Even with the military aid now being forced to be released because of this scandal, that's how this thing is shaking out now in terms of who benefits. Quote, in the past, American diplomats worked closely with Kiev in any talks with Moscow. They presented a united front to the Kremlin. They cajoled the European Union to maintain sanctions. They tried to reassure a nervous Ukrainian public. But now, the United States is largely absent from the political and diplomatic process over resolving the war in the East. The leader of one pro-U.S. political party in Ukraine telling the Washington Post today, quote, Ukraine is now kind of naked. We are alone confronting Russia. David Ignatius at the, excuse me, that was in the New York Times, not the Washington Post. David Ignatius in the Washington Post raising much the same alarm today. Trump's Ukraine machinations have yielded the diminution of U.S. power and a corresponding increase in Russia's military and diplomatic leverage. The United States was an important backup for Ukraine. Losing that support puts Kiev in a weaker bargaining position vis-a-vis Russia. How is the United States shaping events as Ukraine is rebalanced now? America isn't really a player. Trump said in September while meeting Zelensky in New York, quote, "I really hope that you and President Putin can get together and solve your problem." Yeah, we know we used to be your ally, your most important ally. We know we used to stand shoulder to shoulder with you, so you never felt like you had to face Russia alone. But now you're alone. Good luck against Putin now. See what you can work out with him, then get back to me. If it works out, maybe you'll get a White House visit. Otherwise, maybe not. I mean, we are in the middle of this impeachment now, and it is still unfolding, and there is still more to learn, and tomorrow is going to be tomorrow should be a big deal. Even just the news tonight is a big deal. But even after only one day of public hearings so far, I mean, the elephant in the room here feels like it's rearing up and stomping its feet. Because who benefits with all of these things that Trump has done? With all of them. With all the stuff in the middle of the impeachment, but all the other stuff he's doing simultaneously. I mean, it wasn't just pressure on Ukraine to cough up investigations against Joe Biden, right? It was withholding military aid. Withholding the military aid, letting it be known that their military aid was in question. That alone disadvantages Ukraine in their hot war fight against Russia. Benefit to Russia. The U.S. Special Envoy to Ukraine, who is specifically tasked to help Ukraine in its war and its negotiations against Russia, that was this guy, Kurt Volker, who resigned when he was called in to testify in the impeachment proceedings. We've just learned that the Trump administration just isn't going to fill that job now that Volker resigned from it. They're getting rid of that job now. No more dedicated U.S. envoy for helping Ukraine in their war with Russia. I'm sure Russia is delighted by that, too. We learned from the testimony of Foreign Service Officer Christopher Anderson, whose testimony has been released in transcript form. We learned from him that when Russia attacked Ukrainian ships and took a whole bunch of Ukrainian sailors prisoner this time last year, the Trump White House blocked a statement of condemnation from being issued against Russia for having done that. Why did the Trump White House block a statement condemning Russia seizing Ukrainian ships and stealing Ukrainian sailors? Trump White House blocked that. Benefit to Russia. We learned from Anderson as well that when a CNN story ran last year about the U.S. Navy doing an exercise in the Black Sea that was portrayed as the U.S. military standing up to Russia in the Black Sea, President Trump saw that report and called National Security Advisor John Bolton at home to tell Bolton how upset he was by that report. And in response, the White House ordered the Navy to not do that exercise in the Black Sea. Wouldn't want to upset Russia. We learned from National Security Council staffer Catherine Croft, whose testimony has also been released in transcript form, that even after the Trump administration set a new policy that Ukraine would get Javelin missiles from the U.S., and everybody in the administration signed off on that policy, and the State Department, and the Defense Department, and everybody else, National Security Council, everybody's on board. The White House specifically intervened with a late hold on those missiles. Why? What was the White House concerned about? According to Catherine Croft, quote, that Russia would react negatively to the provision of javelins to Ukraine. Yes, we can't have that. I mean, on the day that President Trump was promising that he definitely wasn't watching his first impeachment hearing, that day, President Erdogan of Turkey is at the White House yesterday. And that relationship is weird and inexplicable enough. But when Trump does Erdogan this favor, right, and precipitously pulls U.S. troops out of northeastern Syria, in a phone call with Erdogan, he decides he's going to do that, and he does it. The immediate result is that Turkey and Russia come in to take over that land that our allies and U.S. Special Forces had been holding in northeastern Syria. The U.S. base there literally now has, the American base there now has a Russian flag flying over it. And Russian soldiers are now using that base, and Russian soldiers are now patrolling that part of the country where U.S. troops and U.S. allies were removed by President Trump's actions. We're out. Here, Putin, you can have it. Turkey has also just bought Russian anti-aircraft weapons. Turkey is a member of NATO. Having a NATO member buy advanced Russian weapons systems is a huge military coup for Russia, and it is a crisis for NATO. I mean, not to get into the technicalities of it, but having a NATO member operating a sophisticated Russian anti-aircraft missile system like this potentially exposes the most secret U.S. fighter jet technology to the Russians. Thanks, Turkey. Thanks for doing that. Republican senators who were upset by that and who are upset by the Turkish military attacking our allies in Syria. President Trump waded in during this White House visit to try to smooth that all over, to try to calm down Republican senators about that, to try to make it okay for Turkey. So it's okay that they attacked our allies, and it's okay that they've got to keep those sophisticated Russian weapons. Trump wants Turkey to keep those sophisticated Russian weapons, regardless of what that means for U.S. military superiority and for NATO. Advantage Russia. I mean, even the core weirdness at the heart of the impeachment. Trump didn't just ask Ukraine to announce bogus investigations into Joe Biden, right? Remember what else he asked Ukraine to investigate? He asked them to investigate 2016, specifically this weird conspiracy theory that it wasn't Russia that messed with our elections in 2016, it was Ukraine messing with our elections. So David Stanger in the New York Times tonight calls one of the many odd twists in the partisan noise around the impeachment President Trump's effort to divert attention from suspicions about the 2016 hack away from Russia. He calls it a completely discredited theory that Ukrainian hackers, not Russia's military intelligence, were responsible for the hack. Well, where did this completely discredited theory come from? That it was Ukraine that meddled in the 2016 election and not Russia? I mean, all of U.S. intelligence and the bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee concludes without any equivocation it was Russia who messed with us. The president is advancing this theory that instead it wasn't Russia, it was Ukraine. Ukraine did it. Where does that come from? We actually now have an origin story for where that came from. The recently released, this was just recently released by a court order, recently released FBI interview notes with Trump's deputy campaign chair, Rick Gates, gives us our earliest known appearance of that weird conspiracy theory in the wild. From the FBI interview notes with Rick Gates, quote, Gates recalled Paul Manafort saying the hack was likely carried out by the Ukrainians, not the Russians. Why did Manafort say that? That, quote, parroted a narrative that Kilimnik often supported. Kilimnik, Konstantin Kilimnik, that's the person who was saying that it was Ukraine, not Russia. That's where Paul Manafort got it from. Who's Konstantin Kilimnik? Konstantin Kilimnik is the guy who Manafort worked with for years in Ukraine. Konstantin Kilimnik, who came out of Russian military intelligence, who the FBI assesses is still linked to Russian military intelligence. So this whole thing that the president and the White House and Republicans in Congress now are actively promoting, this conspiracy theory that Russia didn't intervene in the 2016 election, it was Ukraine who did that, that theory appears to have originated with the GRU, with Russian military intelligence, with a Russian military intelligence guy who delivered it to the president's campaign chair, who is in prison for laundering and not paying taxes on the millions of dollars he took from pro-Kremlin political allies and political parties in Ukraine. I mean, the president is now promoting the conspiracy theory that Russia didn't intervene in the election at all, it was Ukraine. That theory is from Russian military intelligence. I mean, I know this impeachment inquiry is about one specific thing that the president did about Ukraine. And it is about that for a reason. I mean, it's proven that he did it. He's admitted that he's done it. It's illegal and impeachable, and he's going to get impeached for it. I get it. But literally everything he is doing here, including the core allegations at the heart of the impeachment, all just happen to benefit Russia. All just happen to redound to the benefit of Russia. All of them. And maybe that is a huge coincidence, but, I mean, what do we do with that? We'll get some help with that next. Joining us once again is Ambassador Susan Rice, who was President Obama's national security advisor, former U.S. ambassador to the UN. Let me ask you, looking at the way that the first impeachment hearing went, looking ahead tomorrow to Marie Yovanovitch, who's going to be testifying tomorrow in the second public hearing, I wonder, as somebody who's been in the crosshairs of not only partisan attacks, but real conservative media, concerted attacks on you over the course of your career, and it's one of the things you write really eloquently about in your book, I wonder how you feel about these career civil servants, foreign service officers, nonpartisan officials people who are not as high profile as you, people who are not super high level political appointees, people who are doing their jobs, having the spotlight on them the way they do right now. I mean, in one sense, it's heartening because they're telling the truth and they are being brave and they're showing America what it is to do that kind of work. On the other hand, the spotlight and the crosshairs on them has got to be scary.
It's got to be scary. It is scary, and it's outrageous, and it's despicable. These are civil servants, career foreign service officers, career intelligence officers, career military officers who have signed up to serve their country for modest pay because they care about the national interest. They've sworn an oath to the Constitution. They're committed to defending it. And, you know, all things being equal, none of them would ever want to be a household name. And here they are being publicly and consistently targeted by the President of the United States. They have bullseyes on their back because the commander-in-chief put them there. It's absolutely outrageous. These are not political appointees. And even when it happens to political appointees, as has happened to me, it's often dishonest and extremely unfair. In this case, these are career civil servants who faithfully served Democratic and Republican administrations for years and done it with professionalism and patriotism. And now their integrity is being impugned, their whole careers are being maligned, and they continue to come forward and tell the truth. What I hope comes out of this, Rachel, is that the American people understand how incredibly committed and intelligent and talented and professional the people who work in the U.S. government are. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, these are the people who keep our country humming on a daily basis.
When you see, I mean, we saw the public smear campaign against Ambassador Yovanovitch, who's going to testify tomorrow. We're seeing the ongoing smear campaigns against Colonel Vindman, Colonel Alexander Vindman.
Purple Heart.
A Purple Heart veteran, combat veteran. And I tell you, when you talk about their bravery and their commitment, I hear you. I also wonder, as a structural matter, having had all the different kinds of jobs you've had in the government, if you feel like there is something we can do to avoid the kind of chilling effect that these attacks on these kind of people is going to have on the civil service, on military officers, on anybody in public service, to know that you might have to walk through this kind of fire just to do your job and just to tell the truth. Can we make up any of that ground again?
Well, first of all, it's never been the case before, and hopefully it won't be the case in the future. I do think and want to believe that in this regard, what we've seen out of Trump and this administration is an aberration. We've never seen civil servants and career officials personally targeted in this way. But the other thing that gives me hope is the fact that they do continue to be honest, to tell the truth, to take great risks. And they're being rewarded in the sense that I think many Americans understand now just how committed and dedicated these people are. And so they've earned our gratitude and respect. And in some ways, I think that may empower people who are continuing to try to serve despite these extraordinary difficult conditions.
They're certainly creating a sense of sort of civic role models in a way that we didn't know we need to have. But
look, public service is extraordinarily rewarding. Even if, like me, you've had a few knives in your back along the way. There's no greater honor than serving your country and working with smart people. And now we have a president who's making it extremely difficult. But these people have served long enough to know that this is not the way it's supposed to be, and hopefully not the way it will long be.
Susan Rice, former National Security Advisor and U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. The new book is Tough Love, My Story of the Things Worth Fighting For. Great to have you here.
Good to see you.
Thanks
so much.
All right, we'll be right back. Stay with us. Yesterday's impeachment hearing, we got the news that the day after the phone call with the Ukrainian president that led to these impeachment proceedings against President Trump, U.S. diplomat Gordon Sondland allegedly called President Trump on his cell phone from a restaurant in Ukraine. An embassy staffer who was with Sondland when he placed the call apparently overheard that conversation, including overhearing President Trump asking Sondland about the investigations that he was pressing Ukraine for. That was yesterday's revelation at the first impeachment hearing. Now, today, the Associated Press was first to report that a second individual can corroborate that account. The AP saying it has learned that, quote, a second U.S. embassy staffer in Kiev overheard a cell phone call between President Trump and his ambassador to the EU discussing a need for Ukrainian officials to pursue investigations. According to the AP, the second diplomatic staffer also at the table was a foreign service officer based in Kiev. A person briefed on what that officer overheard spoke to the AP on condition of anonymity to discuss a sensitive matter currently under investigation. Now, it is important to note that this AP report, as they say, is based on what appears to be a single anonymous source. NBC News has not spoken to anyone who has confirmed this account at this time in terms of the second person overhearing President Trump on the call. But NBC has confirmed that the second Foreign Service officer was accompanying Sondland during that July visit to Ukraine. She was what the State Department refers to as his control officer during that trip. So that means that she was definitely with him. But this additional AP reporting tonight, again, single source, is intriguing because if this bears out, this could be at least a path to another witness who could corroborate this big new development in the impeachment story about the president's personal involvement in the core allegations at the heart of the matter. The reporter who broke that story from the AP joins us next. The Associated Press broke this bananas story about Trump Energy Secretary Rick Perry going over to Ukraine for the inauguration of their new president, and while he was there, putting in a word for two of his campaign donors who would soon apply for a gigantic contract for drilling rights on Ukraine-owned land. Wouldn't you know it, they got a 50-year contract from the Ukrainian government after Rick Perry put in a word for them at the inauguration with their president. Remember how much the Trump administration is trying to fight corruption over there? That same reporting team now has just broken the story that it wasn't just one U.S. Embassy staffer who overheard Ambassador Gordon Sondland talking with President Trump on a cell phone in a public restaurant about the investigations that Trump was seeking in Ukraine. It may have been an additional source as well who heard that call. Michael Biesecker broke that story today along with his team at the Associated Press. You guys are on quite a roll. Michael, thanks very much for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me again, Rachel.
So I mentioned before the break the sourcing on this story, that we've been back and forth with NBC today trying to corroborate it. I know the Washington Post has sort of matched your reporting on this. It does appear that you guys have reported this based on a single source. So I have to ask you how confident you are in that sourcing and in the story.
We wouldn't have gone with a single source if we didn't feel the information was very reliable.
And specifically, this second person is also able to corroborate what we learned in yesterday's first impeachment hearing, that President Trump could be overheard on the call asking about these investigations?
That's our understanding, is that she was sitting at the table during the lunch with Ambassador Sondland and was able to hear the president. Apparently, Ambassador Sondland had his cell phone up pretty loud.
And I don't mean to be too specific and weedy about this, but I've been trying to figure out how this can happen. I mean, unless it's a drop-dead silent restaurant, is it possible that Sondland actually had the president on speakerphone so that he could show off that he was speaking to the president and so other people at the table deliberately could hear him?
You know, like you, we've been trying to figure out how this occurred. I could just say that our information is that Surya Janti was able to hear part of the call, just as the other witness, David Holmes, as testified to by Ambassador Taylor, was able to hear parts of the call, including the president talking about the need for Ukrainian investigations.
And Michael, we know that she had earlier been invited to testify and perhaps had been scheduled to testify, and that was rescheduled around the time of Congressman Elijah Cummings' funeral. Do we know if she is still planning on testifying to the impeachment proceedings, either as a closed-door deposition or in public?
Our understanding is that she was in Washington from Kiev and scheduled to testify, and then, of course, with the death of Representative Cummings, everybody was at his funeral. Things sort of shut down for a couple of days. She went back to Kiev, so at this time, we're not aware that she's currently scheduled to testify.
AP reporter Michael Biesecker, congratulations to you and your reporting team that really have had a number of remarkable scoops on this story just in the past few weeks. Keep going. I don't want to keep you away from your work, sir.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks for being here. All right, we'll be right back.
When I'm president, we're going to reverse those Trump tax cuts.
When I am president, we're going to pass serious gun legislation.
What I intend to do as president is to invest money in jobs.
When I am president.
When I am president.
When I am president.
I want to be the president for all.
I'm running to solve the problems of this time.
As your president, I'll crack down on big pharma.
I'm running for president to take back our democracy.
Tomorrow will be a big day. Not only is tomorrow a Friday in the year 2019, tomorrow is going to be day 2 of the impeachment hearings. Marie Yovanovitch, ousted as Ukraine ambassador. Her testimony in that second impeachment hearing will start at 9 a.m. Eastern. Also tomorrow, a closed-door deposition from somebody named David Holmes. He's the first of potentially 2 U.S. Embassy staffers from Kiev who heard President Trump on a phone call to Ambassador Gordon Sondland in a restaurant in Ukraine, asking Sondland about the investigations into the Bidens that he wanted Ukraine to do. I should also tell you that tomorrow we will be awaiting a jury verdict in the Roger Stone trial. The jury is already out deliberating in that case. It's going to be a big day tomorrow. We'll see you then. That does it for us tonight. Now it's time for The Last Word, where Joy Reid is in for Lawrence tonight. Good evening, Joy.
Good evening, Rachel. So I can tell you that as of tomorrow, you can officially class me as a shut-in. I will not leave my home. No one is to call me. Do not text me. I will not answer. I am so ready for this. I'm fascinated by it. I don't know if you've responded to it the same way. I cannot stop watching
I have to tell you, I'm already nervous now about how fast I need to sleep so that I can be awake and have, like, done all my business, like have breakfast and have a shower and walk the dog and do all the things I need to do so that I'm seated and paying attention by 9, because 9 a.m. is not my key time of day. And so
I'm with you.
I'm already stressed about it.
It's hard because I have insomnia. I have, like, really bad insomnia.
I know you
so
do.
I've been trying to trick myself to fall asleep at 11 so that I can be up at 8. So I'm, like, trying tricks. I've got, like, the Calm app going. Because I'm like, my poor husband, I'm like, I've got to be asleep. I need to be asleep in, like, 10 minutes. I got to get up at 8. You know, it's really bad. Living with me is really not easy this week.
Also, I love that you and I have the same approach to sleeping. You're like, damn it, must sleep now. Focus. Sleep fast.
Turn on Matthew McConaughey app where he reads me story now. Like, it's really bad.
Yeah, and then you scream at it, and it's weird. It doesn't relax you and put you to sleep. I know. We're terrible people. But at least you and I are in the same boat.
There are at least 2 of us. There are 2 of us. I don't feel alone.
I think there's more. You and I will both be awake all night, and then we'll sleep on Saturday. Fair?
There you go.
Fair.
Sounds
Thanks, my
good.
friend. All right.